As above, so below.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard Beitman, MD. I'm a psychiatrist. I love studying meaningful coincidences, synchronicity, and serendipity. Please support us by hitting the button below that says you become part of our group, and please consider joining our Saturday, every third Saturday group of people who talk about their own coincidences. It's called the Coincidence Cafe, and you can get to it by coming to my website or going to the coincidenceproject.com or .net, the coincidenceproject.net, and registering. You just have to register once, and you'll get a reminder every month to be able to come to the Coincidence Cafe. It's part of the Coincidence Project intent is to tell each other coincidence stories as a way of getting people out there to recognize their commonality. Well, my story today goes back a couple of decades. It happened when I was at the end of fifth grade and moved from Shaker Heights near Cleveland, Ohio, to Wilmington, Delaware. It was the end of fifth grade. My mother wanted to be back with her three sisters and their families. There were only 2 weeks left in fifth grade at Edgemore Elementary School, and my brother and Alan and I missed most of them because we went out to pick some blackberries in a field of poison ivy. We were from the Midwest. We didn't know about poison ivy. And then somehow I found out that there was going to be, for the first time at the school, an election for the student council president. Any sixth grader could run. And the Moreland Elementary School in Shaker Heights, where I came from, had a well-established campaign methods set up. And I watched them, and I used them as part of my campaign at the Edgemore Elementary School. I tapped on the shoulder of Jimmy Folks to play his saxophone for Bernie Beitman for president. He got a few other people behind him. And so we walked around this one-level elementary school. Each class was on the first floor and with big windows. And I stood in front of the band and smiled as Jimmy and the other guys played something like the Star Spangled Banner or America the Beautiful. But my favorite part of that election was I put up a poster that got folded in half, and on the front of the poster it said, "Open this poster and you will see who is voting for Bernie B." When they opened the poster, they looked into a mirror and saw themselves. So the new boy won the election. And I bring this up because it's an example of when luck meets up. What luck is when opportunity meets preparation. And the opportunity to be running for president at this new school was there. And I was prepared because I'd seen how to do it before. So that's serendipity in action. You don't know what you're going to get sometimes, but when you see it, you go for it. And that's what I did. And going for it is also part of doing these podcasts. And one of my very favorite people writing about synchronicity is our guest today, Roderick Main. He works at the University of Essex in the UK, where he's professor in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies and director of the Center for Myth Studies. Get that, the director of the Center for Myth Studies. He studies myths. But he does a lot of things, but his books are very synchronistically oriented. One of them is The Rupture of Time, which is what synchronicity experiences can be like. Jung and synchronicities, and Jung and his critique of modern Western culture, Revelations of Chance, synchronicity as spiritual experience, and most recently, Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment, Mystery, Meaning, and Metaphysics in the Work of C.G. Jung. Roderick is a scholar. You can't forget that. This is a very scholarly work. He's got a lot of references in it. However, he writes very clearly in a lot of excellent detail. And it's a book worth reading, especially for those of you interested in knowing something about Jung, because Roderick knows the mind of Jung very, very well, at least from his perspective. And he writes about it clearly. So more than that, he has studied Jung, studied Jung's writings thoroughly, and especially about synchronicity. It's something that has grabbed his attention, and that's going to be our focus today. How synchronicity fits in right now with the way the world operates, the disenchantment of the world, which Roderick will define, and the re-enchantment potential that synchronicity offers us. So, Roderick, welcome to the show. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Bernie. It's great to be here again.
So here we go, and you know what we do here. And so it's time for Roderick to tell us a story.
Okay, well, the story that I'll tell is concerns one of my previous books, the Revelations of Chance, which on the cover of which there was a praying mantis, rather beautifully presented in its kind of classic praying posture. And the choice to put it there was not mine, it was the publisher's. And they'd decided to do it because I started the book with an anecdote relating to a professor of biology who'd had a synchronistic experience involving a praying mantis. One had flown in through the window just as he was about to mention it in a lecture, and so on. It was very powerful.
Let's slow that down for a minute. He was about, this Adolf Portman was about, it was more dramatic than the way you said it, and I think it's worth remembering.
Okay, well, okay, I'll go more slowly. So he was delivering a lecture at Eranos, which is this sort of conference in southern Italy, southern Switzerland, where Jung and lots of other people used to go and present. But on this occasion, Portman was the speaker, and he wanted to end his talk by mentioning the praying mantis because he loved the sonorous sounding name in German. It was the Gottes Anbeterin, God worshipper in German. So he was about to sort of enter this concluding peroration of his talk when an actual praying mantis flew in through the open window of the lecture hall, circled around the lectern at which he was standing, and perched itself on the lectern, just behind or in front of the lectern lamp, to the effect that its kind of arms cast on the wall behind him the image of a huge praying mantis, or praying man, as it were. And this was just as he was about to mention the mantis, and I included this in as the opening anecdote of my book. I didn't further discuss it in the book mainly for the reason that I'd only actually just come across it just before I wrote the introduction, and I didn't have time to think about it or to process it very much. But I thought it was very dramatic, and it was a really classic example, very similar to Jung's famous scarab example in many ways. So I thought I would include it, and the publisher picked up on that.
Just one thing: the difference between the praying mantis story and the Jung scarab story is that Jung went to the window to get the scarab-like beetle, and this guy showed up on his own.
Yeah. Well, Jung scarab was knocking on the window. It was trying to get in.
Okay. I'll give you
yeah. Anyway, so so it was a very interesting and powerful story. So I included it. The publisher picked up on it and did a very nice design on the cover of the book. If I'd had the presence of mind, I should have had the book here so I could show you. But if not, it's easily findable. Beautiful image. But I didn't further think about it for quite a while until well, the book was published, and then I went on a trip to Japan. Oh yeah, there we go. Thank you. I went on a trip to Japan with my family to see my wife's parents, and we were there with our children and so on. And I brought a copy of the book for my parents-in-law. So we'd been sort of talking about it and commenting on the image and so on. And then one day, whilst we were there on that trip, we went to a shrine at the foot of a local mountain, Mount Mikami, and I was away at one of the buildings in the shrine complex, and my wife called me over excitedly, and she and her mother and our two young children were standing around in a circle around this insect that was on the ground. So I joined them in the circle and saw that it was actually a praying mantis. It was the first praying mantis I'd ever actually seen, first living praying mantis I'd ever seen. And it was pretty impressive. It was exactly as on the cover of the book, and pretty big. I mean, it was about 4 inches long, I guess. As we were standing there, looking at it, this praying mantis sort of stepped very gingerly, very slowly and steadily towards me, who just joined the circle, and right up to my shoe, and then it climbed onto my shoe, and then with unbelievable rapidity, it sort of shot up, dashed up my leg and my torso, and it came to rest over the left side of my chest, over where, as I realized afterwards, where my heart would be. And I sort of looked down rather sort of warily at this thing that was on my chest, and it seemed to be looking up at me, and we sort of gazed at each other for a short while, and then I thought I would try and since it didn't seem to have any intention of moving off of its own decision, I decided to try and remove it just by blowing it. But it was a pretty hefty thing, actually. So it made no impression. Blew gently, no impression. Blew more firmly. It didn't have any effect. Then my mother-in-law, who must have seen my intention of sort of getting it off my chest, sort of then lightly flicked it away, and that was the sort of end of the experience as such. So there it was. This insect had appeared on the cover of my book because I'd chosen the story. It had appeared on the cover of the book, but not my intention to put it on the cover of the book. I brought the book to Japan. We'd been talking about it, and then went out and then had this very striking experience with a praying mantis. The first time I'd ever encountered a live one. So it was quite powerful for me, actually, as a synchronistic experience.
When you say, Roderick, it was quite powerful, what do you mean? Because in your book you talk about personal meaning, but you also talk about collective meaning, and I would like to hear you be able to talk about both personal and possibly collective meaning of not only this Portman one, which was pretty dramatic and was the beginning of a book, and here you get that happening years later in Japan, and then again, this praying mantis didn't want to let go of you, just like it hung around Portman. So, how do you personally, what does it mean to you?
Well, I mean, at the time, I suppose the main effect it had on me was because this praying mantis had been put on the cover of my book. I sort of and the book was titled Revelations of Chance, Synchronicity as Spiritual Experience. I associated it. I'd come to begin to associate it with synchronicity itself, also because it had that experience with Portman as well, and there are other ones in the literature actually as well with other people who've had coincidences involving mantises. So to me, it sort of meant it sort of represented in some way my work on synchronicity, and it's apparent. It's sort of, you know, it's paying that very specific attention to me. When I'd sort of been avoiding paying attention to it in a way. But, you know, I hadn't decided to put it on the cover of the book, you know, and I hadn't even noticed it there. You know, it was my wife and family who'd noticed it, not me. But so you know, there was this sort of, suddenly I couldn't ignore it anymore. And it sort of reinforced the sense of my own need to work on the topic of synchronicity, and specifically on the topic of the spiritual implications of synchronicity, at a time when perhaps I was, because of the pressures of other work and in particular the fact that I work in an institution which is not very aligned to these matters, shall we say, you know, it sort of reinforced that I should. It sort of gave me a very deep sense of connection to the topic, and it was a very slow burning thing, I have to say. You know, I didn't feel I had to go out and figure out the meaning of it there and then or whatever. It felt very solid, and I wasn't going to forget about it or any of its important details. And indeed, I didn't really think about it very much for quite a few years because I was preoccupied with other things. But it you know, it sort of always remained there as a sort of presence and so on. And then, so that's at a personal level. There's some of the meaning at a personal level. More collectively, I mean, I tend to treat synchronistic experiences a bit like in Jungian psychology, you might treat a dream, you know, so that you do first of all explore the personal associations to it and what it might mean in your life. But then, when you've sort of extracted what meaning you can out of that, you might also, if you feel there is still something more to explore, you might look at the more collective associations of it, you know, what it has meant in culture, in literature, in mythology, in religion, and so on, or in other experiences. And I'm not entirely sure what to make of all the associations, but it is a very profoundly symbolized and mythologized creature. There's a book by Lorenz van der Post called A Mantis Carol, in which he describes some powerful experiences involving synchronistic experiences actually involving mantises. But his book is also about how the mantis was a sort of sacred being for the first peoples of Southern Africa, and represented a kind of trickster god, you know, a god that would communicate to people what direction they should go in, or answering their questions or something. And people, I think Van der Post said that his somebody who looked after him, I don't know whether it was his grandmother or maybe his nanny or whoever, or somebody used to talk to them, used to communicate with mantises, you know, and sort of get messages from them and so on. So it deeply symbolized in that culture, and then in other cultures as well. You know, in ancient Greece, it was known for sort of helping people find their way home, and in certain parts of ancient Egypt, it had a certain association with the underworld, and there are other cultures that it's meant something in as well. So these are some of the mythological associations, but very much, you know, associated with the sacred, with communicating with other realities, and so on. And then there are also some sort of more modern sort of associations to the praying mantis. The surrealists, both writers and painters, were very interested in it, as for a different reason, actually. You know, they were less interested in the sort of sacred associations than in the fact that the mantis has a habit of, the female mantis, after intercourse, sort of uses those those ostensibly praying hands, which are actually blades for cutting purposes, to cut off the head of the you know, her sexual partner, and then cannibalize him. And the surrealists were very fascinated by this and incorporated it in a lot of their work. And And I discovered recently that that it's also figures largely in in sort of encounters people report having with sort of entities, strange other reality entities. So I learned recently of an account of somebody, Stuart Davis, as an artist and a musician, who made a podcast called Man Meets Mantis, in which he describes his encounter with an 8-foot vision of a praying mantis at the foot of his bed, which presented itself as his guide or something like this, and how that spurred a whole series of mantis coincidences for him. So, and in fact, when I was thinking about this, I learned about that in the middle of a conference where I was writing about my own praying mantis experience and had written up some of it, and then one of the other presenters, Jeffrey Kripal, who writes a lot about very unusual things in a quite brilliant way, gave his presentation on part of a forthcoming book, so it wasn't published yet, but in which he describes some of these praying mantis visions that people have. So there's this whole field of associations which go way beyond my sort of personal connection to it, and I'm not quite sure what they mean, but they certainly point towards other forms of reality, towards the phenomenon of synchronicity itself in a certain way, it's these are sort of things which I'm kind of like still cooking, I guess. I'm not quite sure what to make of them.
Well, there's a lot to cook here from what you just described. The praying mantis from outer space. Simple way of saying one version. The castrating praying mantis, which is what the surrealists got into, because Freud was talking about castration around the same time, but instead of it cut off the head of the praying mantis.
Yeah.
But then there's the more of symbolic, personal meaning of a praying mantis that can be meaningful somehow. And we come back to what you mean by synchronicity, and what you understand Jung to have meant by synchronicity, and how the praying mantis experience of Adolf Portman in the classroom and you in Japan begin to have some kind of mythological, personal, psychological, transpersonal, unus mundus, something that it has to do with you and your operation in the world. And from what I can tell, just in my simplistic ways of thinking about these things, is that you are being encouraged to embrace the trail of potential that you just outlined in the praying mantis descriptions, from your own personal and Adolf Portman to Southern Africa, to the surrealists, to the reports of all these looking like praying mantises from outer space kind of looking people. So the praying mantis begins to encompass much of what I think you are trying to encompass, going from the personal to the transpersonal, or the personal to the collective. And the praying mantis sounds to me, from your description, describing the arc and some of the details of what that might look like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think one could say that it's certainly a suggestive symbol. I mean, there are other features of it that I mean, one thing I didn't mention was its role in martial arts as well. There are martial arts practices which are based on its movement, because its method of catching its prey as well is very interesting, because it's very invisible, and then and dead still, and then then it moves very quickly and performs its actions very quickly, and is reputed for taking on prey much larger than itself as well. So, there's a lot to kind of learn from its behavior, I think, in which maybe is relevant to how one needs to engage with synchronicity in relation to the much bigger phenomenon of the consensus worldview.
I like that one, Roderick. I like that one.
You have to have the courage to take it on, and you have to wait patiently, and then the moment arrives, you have to act very decisively. Yeah. But yeah, it is a powerful symbol, and it's, as you say, it's got these sort of transpersonal implications, and there is a sense in which, in a lot of the mythology about it, it serves as a kind of guide, including in the sort of the modern sort of abduction narrative, or alien entity encounter narratives. It's got a sort of a guide function. So maybe there is something of that. So I'll keep an eye out anyway. You don't get many of them in the UK, unfortunately, in the wild. but as a symbol in that I encounter, I will keep an eye on it further.
That it landed on your heart too.
Mm.
And when we talk about personal, you didn't want to see it. Somebody else had to show it to you. And then when it ended up on you, and it crawled up determinedly to your heart, and you couldn't get rid of it. Somebody else had to make it go away. Roderick, for a guy who studies symbols, we got quite a set of symbols right there.
I know, yes, yeah. Well, I mean, maybe in a way, it's a good segue into talking about disenchantment, because landing on the heart, the sort of the center of thinking with the heart, or a more emotional response, or a more a different kind of response to the world and to reality from the heart than from the head, simply, or from the what Max Weber called the sort of intellectualization and rationalization that are associated with what he called disenchantment. So that experience, like many synchronistic experiences, really seem to be sort of challenging in some way, that sort of disenchanted way of thinking, that over-rational way of thinking.
Well, we're going to have to discuss enchantment, disenchantment, and enchantment in a bit, but I want to be able to have our audience know from you, who knows Jung to me better than most people, about what the elements of synchronicity are. And one of the problems that I like to bring up is that Jung didn't use the word synchronicity to mean meaningful coincidences. He used it as an acausal connecting principle to explain meaningful coincidences. However, the terms get blurred, and have been blurred now for quite a bit, so that they are equivalent. But one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that Jung listed 3 elements as representative of synchronistic experiences, and one of them is the scarab, which is like the Adolf Portman talking about something, and then the scarab in this story shows up, and Portman's the praying mantis shows up. But the 2 other ones that don't get a lot of acknowledgement are precognition and clairvoyance. And I was always surprised to see that in Jung's list, telepathy was not listed, although it could be included under one of them that sounds like clairvoyance, the event someplace taking place someplace else, but it really sounds like an event, not somebody's mental experience. So I wonder if you would talk a bit about Jung's inclusion of these more parapsychological sounding things of telepathy, or the psi phenomena of precognition and clairvoyance as part of what Jung listed as examples of synchronistic experiences.
Yeah, well, I think he Jung thought of synchronicity as a sort of an overarching concept for all of these phenomena. He did use the term. He used the term in both of the ways you described. Actually, he used it as a term for, meaningful coincidence, describing the experience. He does use the term in that sense sometimes, but he also used it as you say, to represent to refer to the explanatory principle that accounts for such experiences. So there is an ambiguity there, but it's interesting because it shows that he's going from what's immediately experienceable, the meaningful coincidence, something that is, as your own work has shown, it's something that lots and lots of people have, and lots of people are puzzled by, and it presents this challenge to one's view of reality. So it's really quite important that the experiential element is there. But he also realizes that, just noting that is one thing, but trying to make some sort of explanation for it is another. So his concept is also trying to do that explanatory work. And in a sense, it's a principle of acausal connection through meaning. Acausal in the sense that the events are connected. The events in a synchronicity are connected in a way that is not explicable in any plausible way by normal sort of efficient causality that we would use to explain things in scientific terms. They don't readily, they don't connect in that kind of way. What connects them is the fact that they express the same kind of meaning, in the sense that they've got the same content, and also that their co-occurrence sort of in some way expresses a deeper meaning that involves one's subjectivity, but also involves the world. So it expresses some sort of deeper meaning, and that meaning one's exploration of that meaning can go very deep, I think, and that's where you go from personal dimensions of it, right into sort of collective and cultural dimensions, and they can be profoundly meaningful. So it had all those aspects to it, but then he also thought of he wanted to understand the whole range of sort of parapsychological experiences, which he'd had plenty of in his life, and I include some in the book that you showed, the Breaking the Spell of Disenchantment, and of his own experiences. And he wanted to develop synchronicity partly in order to make sense of those experiences, and his concept does. He, in his view, makes better sense of parapsychological experiences than the terms that had been developed in psychical research and parapsychology, like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, in the sense that it identified what was common about them all, which was that there was a meaningful coincidence between a mental content and a physical event, which was either happening at the same time or remotely in space or remotely in time. So he was interested in, or he was trying to find a way of expressing something essential to all of those experiences to enable him to theorize it better. And he lit upon this idea of acausal connection through meaning to express that. But in doing that, or the way he accounts for those particular experiences is that he suggests that in the experience, it shows that at a certain level in the unconscious mind, or in I suppose in reality, but in more generally, but specifically in the unconscious mind, space and time don't operate always in the kind of way that we experience them in normal daily life. So that space and time, he thinks, can be relativized, so that what spatially and temporally remote events can somehow be known in the here and now, and as images, he says, that one knows them as images, and then the event subsequently happens, and you see the parallel with the image that you've already experienced. So that's a sort of a very difficult to understand aspect or feature of the unconscious as Jung understood it. It's related to a lot of ancient and ways of thinking that were quite prevalent in 19th century German idealist philosophy, was their ideas of intellectual intuition and so on as well. So it's not an entirely new concept by any means, but it was quite central to his way of understanding things, that the unconscious psyche can sort of access this information, or can know things that in some sense are remote from its seeming present. And I think telepathy is included for Jung, as well as clairvoyance. Maybe he doesn't. When he gives one example. He gives an example of a patient of his who. Well, he describes it. He'd been at I think he'd been giving a talk somewhere, and he was going to his hotel room, and he goes to. He's trying to fall asleep, and then suddenly he has a sense of. I think he said he has a sense of some. Maybe it was his patient or something. A sense of his patient had come into the room or something, and then he had a sense of a dull pain at the back of his head. A sudden sharp dull pain at the back of his head, and he went to see, there was nobody there, and he tried to figure out, and he couldn't figure it out, but he got news the following day that this patient had committed suicide and had shot themselves in the head, and the bullet had come to rest at the back of the skull, and he seemed to in some way have felt that. It's a classic sort of crisis apparition kind of experience, of the kind that the early psychical researchers used to collect. So that I think would be a case, quite a grim one, but a case of a sort of telepathic, if you like, synchronicity. Of course, he could interpret it, as you say, in terms of clairvoyance as well, but he could even interpret it as precognition, in the sense that he was going to get the news about the death the following day. But there are different. That's the part of the problem with these categories, that they're difficult to sort of pin down. But certainly the feeling element is quite powerful in that example, I think.
I tend to fully agree that this is telepathy in the original definition of telepathy, where it's tele at a distance, but it's feeling or emotion or pain at a distance. This is what telepathy originally meant, and has come to be more cognitive. But I believe that Jung had telepathy in it. I was just looking at the definitions that he had used for not definition, but the examples. And I think you're clarifying that well enough. But I wanted our audience to be able to recognize more clearly that it was more than a scarab story that Jung meant by telepathy, by synchronistic events, that they're also included these parapsychological or psi events.
Yeah.
One of the purposes of your book, if not the major one, is in the title. That you're being able to see synchronicity as one way of breaking the disenchantment of the modern world, which is the great emphasis that we place on rationality and tuning down our capacity for intuitive information, which synchronicity can be an example of. But in the title, I have a particular question as we get towards what disenchantment means. You have the words meaning and mystery, and you repeat them often in pairs in your book. Mystery and meaning are together. So to me, my question for you is there's a mystery to the relationship between mystery and meaning that I'm asking you to be able to explicate for us.
Okay, well, they are the two terms are sort of conjoined in several times in the book, but in a kind of a list, really, in a series. I do treat them somewhat separately, in the sense that I have a chapter on mystery, a chapter on meaning, and a chapter on metaphysics. So I'm sort of thinking about them in different ways, but they do tie together. Those three things tie together because they're the they're the things that are, in a sense, negated or denied by the view of that the world is disenchanted. I mean, disenchantment means, I mean, literally, the German term that Max Weber used, Entzauberung, means demagicking, getting rid of, elimination of magic. And Weber thought this was a process that had been going on for millennia, actually, since the emergence of theological and philosophical systems that postulated the idea of a sort of a single reality, an absolute reality over and above and separate from the created world and so on. And so that any sort of idea of magic, where there's an implied interrelation between the sort of the divine world or the sacred world and the natural world, gets eliminated or gets sort of marginalized. And this is what Weber thought had happened in the development of monotheism in the West, particularly in Protestantism, but also in other forms of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So what's being suggested with this sort of idea of getting rid of the magic is that that you end up progressively, and it's for Weber, this came to a head in the modern period, in the period in which he was working, the sort of late 19th, early 20th century, when he and Jung were both sort of working. It comes to a head where the idea is that you don't need to assume any magical or mystical realities in order to explain the world. All you need is empiricism and reason. This sort of more rational approach, a more intellectual approach, and another implication of that is that meaning is not something that science should really concern itself about. I mean, science is about telling you what's out there, what really is happening in the world, in the sort of the reality that we can measure and perform experiments on, and there's no value in it, in its sense of it can't tell you whether something's valuable or not. It can just tell you how it behaves and whether it is and what it does and so on. But it can't tell you whether it's right or wrong or good or bad. So the values and the meaning is sort of imputed from somewhere else, Weber suggests. So it's not intrinsic to gaining knowledge as such, to our knowledge processes. So the disenchanted view, in a sense, denies that there's any genuine mystery. Everything can, in principle, says Weber, be interpreted in terms of empiricism and reason. But it can't tell us, anything about meaning, because that's beyond the range of what science can do. So there's this separation between fact and value, this sort of classic separation between facts and value. Science can tell us the facts, but it can't tell us the value or the meaning of those facts. And then the third thing is that also bound up with those is that that disenchantment seems to imply that that there are no grounds for believing in any sacred reality, any metaphysical reality, any transcendental, spiritual, divine reality beyond what presents itself empirically. So in effect, the notion of disenchantment negates denies that there is any genuine mystery, that there is any inherent meaning in reality. There's nothing, you can't look under the microscope and find meaning, or through the telescope and find meaning. It just, it just finds a material reality that is intrinsically meaningless, and we foist meaning onto it. Is the idea, and there's also no sacredness that you can find. That's sort of denied as well. And all of those things together suggest that there is an impossibility, really, ultimately, of reconciling science and spirituality, science and religion, because there's no grounds. There are no really good intellectual or empirical grounds for believing in anything to do with religion or the spiritual or the sacred, according to this outlook. So, for Weber, you can still believe in spirituality if you want to, but you have to make an intellectual sacrifice to do it. You have to sort of put your what you know about science to one side. So that's the sort of that's the sort of predicament of disenchantment. And when Weber articulated that in the second, I mean, it was about 1917 when he gave the lecture in which he famously spoke about it. This was the same time that Jung was grappling with the same problem in his own way, but obviously coming to different conclusions. He also thought that the way in which our scientific modern culture was dominated by this kind of thinking, which was over intellectual, over rational, and was denying the spiritual reality, sacred reality, and found that deeply problematic because he'd had experiences that told him otherwise. So what I've suggested in my book is that a lot of his work, in fact, in some sense, all of his work is, it's not the only thing it's doing. Obviously, it's got its other motivations as well. But one of the things is that he's responding to the sort of cultural environment of his time, that there was this tremendous pressure to see things in this disenchanted way. Of course, with exceptions, lots of exceptions. And of course, there are good things about disenchantment as well, because of course it leads to all sorts of, science, technology, and all the economic and cultural benefits that flow from that. But there's also the deep problem that it excludes whole areas of experience. It creates a vision of reality in which reality is fundamentally meaningless, which is a pretty grim thing, because if there's no actual meaning in reality and it's just what we make up, then it's very difficult to find, arguments to oppose the sort of predatory and exploitative behaviors that have caused so much sort of devastation to the planet and to personal and social relations. So it's quite a serious problem, and also leads to profound personal alienations, which, as a psychiatrist, I'm sure you know a tremendous amount about how people, if you don't have a sense of meaning in life, it can be, your life can fall apart, and you get all sorts of psychological problems as well. So it was a great problem that Jung was trying to address with his work, and in a sense, you can see throughout his work, I think, that he affirms precisely the opposite of what disenchantment is affirming. Jung affirms the reality of mystery, and there's probably, no clearer area in which he does that than in his work on synchronicity, where he takes, very bizarre experiences of all these kinds of interested parapsychologists and psychical researchers and so on, and he says, let's take these seriously. These are important parts of human experience. Let's take them seriously, and not just see them as intellectual exercises or challenges to our thinking. How can we explain these in the most sophisticated way? But let's see what they actually mean. Let's see what is the human meaning in them, and let's not assume that meaning is just something that we're making up subjectively and projecting onto an inherently meaningless cosmos in order to make ourselves feel a little bit more comfortable within it. Let's, meaning, he suggests, he goes to great lengths in his essay on synchronicity to argue for the plausibility of meanings being something that is actually an inherent feature of reality that we find as much as we create. Not that we don't contribute to the meaning. Of course, there's a subjective component to it, but it's a meeting of something that is really there in reality, that is also speaking to us, that we're enfolded in. Our meaning making is we make meaning, or we participate in making meaning by dint of the fact that we are part of the reality that is also inherently meaningful. So this is the sort of vision that he's developing, and he's also, of course, with all his work on psychology of religion, he's trying to retrieve the idea of the sacredness of reality. The religious element. He's trying to bring it as close as he can to scientific ways of looking, and he is trying to reconcile, in a sense, science and spirituality to show that the one doesn't exclude the other. So he's doing that, and synchronicity is important for that aspect of his work as well, I think, because one of the things, as I'm sure many of the experiences that you've collected would testify, and certainly my own experiences do, and many of the ones that I've worked on and encountered, that they're often experienced by people as kind of mini revelations of some spiritual aspect of reality, something that goes beyond the purely psychophysical interpretation of reality, and reveals that there is this meaning and also this sort of sacrality, if you like, to reality. There's this numinosity about the experiences that points to this other level or aspect of our experience. So I think with his work, his whole psychological project really can be viewed, as I try to do in the book, as a response to this condition, and can be seen as offering, through very close engagement with the dark side of experience and the disenchanted side of experience, which he's not at all eliminating. He thinks it's quite important, but he's trying to find his way through to this other more magical and more sacred and meaningful and mysterious reality.
Roderick, that was a beautiful essay you just delivered. It was a beautiful essay you just delivered. And there's several questions that I have, and one I'll start with is, again, the relationship between mystery and meaning. And for me, it's this, the mystery is a mystery. And a mystery, I'm Sherlock Holmes, which I've often had some idea about being is I'm a detective trying to figure out what's going on around here. And synchronicity is a clue to how reality works. And so you start with the mystery. The person comes to Sherlock Holmes and saying, I have these problems, I don't know what's going on out there. And that becomes the mystery and the coincidence arriving is that mystery. And then we go about trying to solve the mystery by finding meaning someplace. So to me, they're very directly related.
Yeah. I mean, I think as I understand Jung, and I'm not necessarily everybody would understand his work in the same way as I do. I mean, I think his work. I mean, his work is, the core concept of his work really is individuation. It's about a process of psychological transformation, integrating, reconciling the conscious and unconsciousness and so on to create a greater sense of psychological wholeness. And wholeness is a key term in his work. He refers to his ultimate archetype, if you like, the archetype of the self, as the archetype of wholeness. And it all seems to be pointing in that direction. And in his latest work, the work right at the end of his life on individuation, his large work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, he shows how, at its furthest reaches, if you like, the process of individuation leads towards deeper and deeper experiences of unity, uniting the sort of contents of one's own mind, so one's kind of unified within oneself, as it were, mentally, then achieving some sort of unity of that mental unity with one's body and with one's external life, and then he talks even about uniting that sort of spiritual, psychic, physical unity with what he calls the unus mundus, the one world, the sort of the world of potential out of which all of empirical reality flows. So this is quite a profound mystical notion that he's talking about. It's what the sort of medieval Western mystics referred to as the unio mystica, the mystical union, or in Eastern terms, comparable terms, you have samadhi or satori or Tao and so on. Jung finds these terms, he uses all of these terms actually in relation to this experience. And I think he sees synchronistic experiences as sort of being experiences that help one, that emerge as one moves deeper into that process of individuation, and that both help to advance it and also express it, if you like. There are some very interesting, when we talked about parapsychological experience, how synchronicity accounts for so telepathy and precognition and psychokinesis as well in to stretch and telepathy. But it also for Jung can express. He says, and this is quite early when he says this. It can express the common mystical experience, the sense of being in Tao, the sense of being in harmony with everything that's going on. With one's inner life is in harmony with what's going on outwardly, and things seem to fall into place in this kind of with this sort of natural flow. He describes that as synchronicity. He says, he talks about Tao, and he says, well, I have my own term for it, which is synchronicity. So interesting. So he sees the whole process really as moving towards a culmination in this sense of mystical union, in my view, and in that sense, meaning. I think for Jung, meaning is not that far away from what he means by wholeness. As you experience deeper sense of wholeness, what you experience is a deeper sense of interconnectedness, a deeper sense of coherence, and so on. That is the sense of meaning. They're almost like different ways of talking about the same thing. These deeper reaches of individuation are, in exactly the same extent that they are deeper experiences of wholeness, they are also deeper experiences of meaning for Jung. But the meaning that you're experiencing is not one that you can articulate in very easily in discursive terms. Partly because as you go deeper into these states, they start becoming participative. The observer and observed distinction breaks down, and it becomes much more sort of reciprocal and participative. But then even ultimately, if one follows it through, it becomes more unitive, so that the distinction between sort of inner and outer, self and world, becomes loses its meaning. It's in itself, in a sense, it becomes difficult to then articulate what you're experiencing. And this is what people have classically talked about with mystical experiences, the ineffability, and other altered states, the difficulty of articulating them. It's difficult to put it into words. So the if one's looking for a sort of too clinical and clean and efficient a description of synchronicity and meaningful coincidence, I think there are points beyond which one will start being disappointed, because I think there is something inherently ungraspable about it. I mean, there is a language. There's the language of mysticism and the language of all the altered states and so on, which is very helpful for trying to articulate some of it. But that language is peppered with disclaimers about what can't be contained in that language. And I think that's the same with synchronicity. I think it points all the way, really.
Well, now I understand the meaning of meaning, which, of course, I've had a lot of fun with just what is the meaning of meaning. And that 1921-22 book, and with the same title, is incomprehensible for me. It's just even though it's been.
Yeah, that was written by a sort of analytic philosopher, though, wasn't it? I think.
Yes.
Sorry, well, using the wrong tools.
It's very light. Yes, analytical philosopher, sure. But that's still, when you introduced me to the four meanings of meaningful coincidences, namely the parallel meaning of the incidents themselves, the similarities, the emotional response of maybe numinosity, but something emotional, surprising at least, and then the personal meaning, and then the explanatory meaning. Those were very helpful for me in tracking what I meant by meaning in meaningful coincidences. But now you've done, you've expanded the meaning of meaning from your description you just had. And because I've been realizing that in order for me to understand something, I have to have had some idea about it in the first place. So it's a recognizing, it's a recognition, meaning that I've thought of it before. So when you describe how You want to unify the conscious and the unconscious, and unify that with your body, and unify that with what's around you. Then you have begun to have experiences of meaning, of connection, of resemblance between what's in you and what's outside of you, what it seems to be outside of you. So you can recognize them both, and then they can be joined together both by your own subjectiveness and the reality of its being out there. You have to track along. And now meaning is the meaning of meaning in your book. Again, I show it to our audience because there's meaning here again with mystery. The mystery is allowing, for me, looking for the meaning that is out there. And the fundamental notion that you are bringing to us through your work, through your experience, through your understanding of Jung, is there is meaning out there for us to find, and that we can come to it and match with it, and may not be able to describe it, but we can experience it. And that is the meaning of what I think you are trying to suggest, that disenchantment can be unraveled from, so that we can then find that meaning that is inherent out there, that's in us, and that we were part of all the same thing.
Yeah. Can I just say one more thing about this? I mean, there's a because I sort of, you know, I spoke about the more re-enchanting side of this, and mainly, but of course I think Jung does also highlight the disenchanting side of things. You know, that for him, in the book that you just showed, I try to make a distinction between what I call naive enchantment, disenchantment, and re-enchantment. And re-enchantment is this sort of is in a sense a recovery of a sense of the sacred that is beyond it's a sort of mature sense of enchantment, if you like. It's beyond having been disenchanted, having withdrawn projections, having worked through one's fantasies, you know, and one's erroneous thoughts as much as possible. So in sort of undoing disenchantment and in promoting re-enchantment, Jung is not, in a sense, implying that one should sort of abandon reason, abandon critical thinking, sort of plunge into sort of ecstatic states or anything just for the sake of it. I think rather he's implying that the best way of getting to a re-enchantment is to work through the disenchantment, if you like, which means to be highly critical of oneself, of one's ideas, of Jung's ideas, of our ideas, you know, being you know, quite skeptical and critical, and really interrogating and not allowing oneself to be just sort of superficially comforted, but to really want to know, and then and to you know, and I suppose there's a sort of trust involved in that, which is that if you are critical in that way, that there is something, you know, there's something beyond the deconstruction. You know, there are experiences to be had, realities to be found, beyond what the most rigorous sort of empiricism and reason can come up with. So it's really partly about an undoing of the overemphasis on, or the belief that a disenchanted perspective, one where you kind of strip the illusions away, is the final state. You know, that reality. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has a wonderful notion, what he calls subtraction stories, which he thinks have dominated a lot of, you know, Western philosophy and thinking in the modern period, which is the idea that religion and all the paraphernalia of pre-modern thought was a kind of illusion that we've now seen through. This is the narrative, and that we've stripped it all away, and what we're left with is now the truth, which is this kind of this world of immanence, this disenchanted world of pure immanence and physical and meaningless and so on. This is the reality. And now we have to, as Weber puts it, we have to bear with it like men, you know, or using men in a sort of, you know, the moral sense rather than the gendered sense. You know, but I think, you know, that's kind of all very well in a way, but I think what Charles Taylor is saying is that this disenchanted world is not just what's left over. It's actually something that we've created as a culture. It's not you strip away the illusions and this is left as the reality. It's that we have, as a culture, have created disenchantment. We've created this vision of reality, and we didn't need to, and we can adjust it. We can open it up, problematize it, open it up, and I think synchronistic experiences and the reflections to which synchronistic experiences and theorizing in this area, and who knows whether Jung is right or somebody else is right about it, but thinking about it opens up ways of thinking about reality which are much broader than those that seem to be commonly pursued. You know, doing that is one of the best ways of sort of you know, creating a condition in which I think we can come up with a sort of richer views of, you know, the world we live in, and not allow ourselves to be under the spell, as I put it in the book, of a disenchanted vision of reality.
Roderick, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
It's a wedge into the hyper-rationality, disenchanted world. However, I go along with the idea that it's the methods of science and the aims of spiritual that I am doing myself, because, well, you understand that. And another way of saying, maybe other people would also resonate with what you're saying. Another way of saying it is, in order to going from the naive enchantment, disenchantment to re-enchantment, it's a lot like in order to lose an ego, you have to have had an ego, which is running a personal parallel for what you're saying. And we are talking about, you and I are talking about a method of re-enchantment in synchronicity that is there to be had. It's not there. It's my job, probably more than yours, is to alert people who aren't even thinking this way to the reality of meaningful coincidences occurring around them on a regular basis. So these clues are there, and they can open up new realities. And what you do for the field is marvelous, and I'm so happy that we have been able to talk today. We've got to come to the end of this for now, but you're so articulate and clear about all this stuff. You're such a good mind in describing this, so verbally adept, if you don't mind my saying, and being able to describe such difficult concepts. And I thank you not only for me and for our audience, but for all those who have the opportunity to read what you write and also to hear what you have to say. So thank you very much, Roderick, for being with me today. Is there anything you'd like to add before we end?
Not really, just to thank you in turn for the work that you do and for the opportunity to be on this show, and for all the other episodes in your series, you know, which are themselves a tremendous resource for anybody who is interested in this area.
Oh, that's that's very kind of you, Roderick. That's very kind of you. So until we meet again, which is going to be pretty soon, I'll see you then.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.